was. But once again, I'd like to thank Pastor Whitmer and thank the church for your gracious hospitality. I've thoroughly enjoyed being back in the Haven of Rest. My family and I were there a while back, and my kids really enjoyed their time there, and it hasn't been a blessing to stay there again. And I'm looking forward to this last session because really it gets into some of the nuts and bolts. If you want a title for it, it's got a critique of biological evolution. And so that's what we're going to be talking about, maybe a little more technical than some of the other presentations, but I hope this will be a blessing to you as well. And so when we're talking about this topic, once again, where do we start? And I want to do the same thing that I did earlier when we were talking about geology and whatever field we're looking at. You can take the claims of evolution, you can look at the claims of the Bible, and then what we want to do is compare the two theories and see which theory handles the evidence the best, without having to constantly modify it. And so that's what we want to do. Now, I'm going to give credit where credit is due. A lot of my slides, not all of them, come originally from a presentation by a man named Mike Riddle. Mike Riddle had worked at one point for the Institute for Creation Research, at one point for Answers in Genesis. I don't even remember where he's at exactly now, but I've modified some of his presentation. Matter of fact, some of my previous presentations, a few came from him as well. We're talking about evolution. Obviously, the theory goes that you start there at the very bottom with some simple life form, and then you work your way up to man, microbe to microbiologist, you could say. Molecule to man is the idea, and that's what we want to critique tonight. Is that possible? And what does the evidence say? And obviously, to get it all started, you have to have a simple life form of some type to get everything started initially. So there's only two possibilities for the origin of that initial life form, whatever it was. And really these two possibilities exhaust all options. And number one, a life evolved by natural processes, or number two, life was created. All right, so those are really your two possibilities. Now, the model of evolution, and again we have two models. The model of evolution claims that about 4.6 billion years ago the earth was formed. Chemicals formed initially in this primordial soup that was on the earth. These chemicals bonded together to form molecules, and then these molecules eventually bonded together to make some sort of a simple living cell. In other words, you could say time plus chance led to life. Now that's in contrast with the creation model, where in Colossians 1:16, for instance, the Bible says, "For by him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him." Here, let me give you a quote. This is from Sir Fred Hoyle, who was a British scientist. He's passed away at this point. But he once made this statement referring to the probability of life arising by way of spontaneous generation. In other words, non-life leading to life just randomly by way of this, these chemicals in this primordial soup. He said that the chance that higher life forms might have emerged in this way is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein. Now, why would he make a statement like that? Well, he would make a statement like that because life is incredibly complex. Let me give you another quote, this time from Michael Denton. I think I've referred to him at least once before. He's an agnostic, but he's written a book called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. He's a microbiologist, and he makes this statement: is it really credible that random processes could have constructed a reality, the smallest element of which, a functional protein or a gene, is complex beyond our own creative capacities, a reality which is the very antithesis of chance, which excels in every sense anything produced by intelligence of man? Alongside the level of ingenuity and complexity exhibited by the molecular machinery of life, even our most advanced artifacts appear clumsy. We feel humbled as Neolithic man in the presence of 20th century technology. What he's saying in essence is simply this: you take a single cell in your body, and that cell is by far, not even close, far more complicated than any computer or any machine that man has even dreamed of constructing. There's no comparison. I mean, what machine has man ever created that can reproduce itself, for instance? All right, so life is incredibly complex. Let me go back to that Boeing 747 illustration. A Boeing 747 has about 4.5 million parts. And none of those parts fly by themselves, but they can be arranged in such a way as designed by a human engineer that that thing can fly. Well, a single cell has not millions of parts, but literally billions of parts, none of them alive by themselves, but they can be arranged in such a way that you have life. So, using our tornado example, you can have all the parts for that 747 lying in an open field, everything that you need to assemble the airplane, and you can run a tornado through that field 1,000,000 times, but you're never going to assemble the plane from that. All right? Because we all know that doesn't work that way. And when it comes to life, when you start out, to form simple proteins, you have to have amino acids arranged in just the right sequence. There's 20 different amino acids that make up the proteins of life, and they have to be arranged just right, just like, for instance, when you're playing Scrabble and you have all these English letters and you have to arrange them in the right way to form words. So these amino acids have to be arranged just right to form the proteins. Let me talk a little bit before we go on about probability and statistics. And let's do that by way of an example. Let's say we're to flip a coin. So we have a penny in our hands, and we're going to go and flip that thing. And I know you know the answer to this first question. What is the probability that you will get ahead? The heads on one flip, well, it's obviously 1 in 2. But how about 2 in a row? Well, that probability would be 1 in 4. How about 3 heads in a row? It would be 1 in 8. 8 heads in a row would be 1 in 256. But to get 100 in a row, it would be 1 in 2 to the 100th power, which would be equivalent to 1 in 10 to the 30th power. So 1 with 30 zeros after it. Now, hypothetically, if I were to stand up here and flip a coin and I got 100 heads in a row, is there anybody in this room that would believe that that is a legitimate coin? And hopefully none of you would fall for that. All right, that is obviously a 2-headed coin if I were to flip it 100 times and get all heads. So that's the way probability works. Now, let me give you a few more statistics. The odds of forming a small protein of only 100 amino acids, all right, randomly, the odds of that would be 1 in 20 to the 100th power or 10 to the 130th power. Now, some evolutionists will counter that, all right, that may be true, but sometimes you can substitute one amino acid for another and still have the same basic function. All right, even accounting for that. There's been a couple scientists that have worked on that. Information scientist Hubert Yockey has calculated, and MIT biologist Robert Sauer has confirmed by experimentation that that would still only increase the probability to 1 in 10 to the 65th power. So 1 with 65 zeros after it. Now, I actually got this statistical information from a book called Of Pandas and People that's co-authored, and I've got him highlighted, a man by the name of Dean Kenyon. Dean Kenyon, he had authored a book called Biochemical Predestination that at one time was the leading textbook on this subject of so-called chemical evolution, or the idea of the spontaneous generation of life. He once believed that, and he wrote the standard textbook on the subject. Well, he doesn't believe any of that anymore. He's actually a part of the intelligent design movement now, and he is the co-author of this book that I just quoted from. So he rejects that entirely. Now, 1 with 65 zeros after it, that's a number we can't even comprehend in our mind. I mean, that is so big that we can't even fathom a number like that. Let me give you some comparisons. If the universe really is about 30 billion years old, as they claim, there would be only 10 to the 18th seconds in the history of the universe. And that means there'd only be a fraction of enough time. If you were able to, you got 100 amino acids that you're trying to line up the right way, if you had the ability to somehow line them up every second, a new combination, and you were doing that every second, you know, for millions and millions and millions, you don't have even a fraction of enough time to try every possible combination. All right? And besides all that, 100 amino acids would be far less than you need for life. You'd be something at least 400 or 500 amino acids at a minimum to get the very simplest form of life. Sir Fred Hoyle, that I quoted earlier, along with Chandra Ramaswamy, they actually used computers at one point to calculate the odds, and I think they used computers, graduate students and all that, but to calculate the odds of the formation of an amoeba by chance. There's about 2,000 different proteins or enzymes in an amoeba, and they calculated the probability to be 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. It's a 1 with 40,000 zeros after it. And here's a quote from Hoyle and Wickramashan. They said, "The likelihood of the spontaneous formation of life from the inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 knots after it. It's big enough to bury Darwin in the whole theory of evolution. There was no primeval soup, neither on this planet nor on any other, If the beginnings of life were not random, they must have been the product of purposeful intelligence. You have a couple of what you might argue were reluctant creationists in a sense. All right, they never embrace creation like we do, but nonetheless, they're honest with the evidence there. As a result of calculations like this, there have actually been some well-known evolutionists that have even began to postulate that perhaps life came from outer space. Here's a quote about a decade ago. Orgel and Crick, that's referring to Leslie Orgel and Francis Crick, who, by the way, got a Nobel Prize for the discovery of the DNA molecule, the structure of that, managed to provoke the public and their colleagues by speculating that the seeds of life were sent to Earth in a spaceship by intelligent beings living on another planet. Orgel says that the proposal, which is known as directed panspermia, was, quote, sort of a joke. Now, let me ask a question, all right? How does that solve your problem? Because all that does is push the problem back in time. Because how are the odds any different in outer space? Because life still had to originate someplace. So if it originated in space and came here, you still have to ask the question, how did it originate in space? And how are the odds any better in space? All you've done is move the problem back. You haven't solved the problem. Now here's the evolutionist counter-argument. They will argue that given enough time, anything can happen. All right, now is that a scientific statement? And is that a valid statement? And I would like to argue that it's not. We've already seen that a single protein of only 100 amino acids, the probability would be 1 in 10 to the 130th power. A single cell, 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. 30 billion years of time is only 10 to the 18 seconds. So I think that we could conclude, as this individual did, the likelihood of life having occurred through a chemical accident is for all intents and purposes 0. And I agree totally with that. In other words, I don't care if you have infinity at your disposal, you still don't have enough time. Now, let me give you an illustration. I was once at the Smithsonian Institution several years ago in the section that dealt with the origin of life. And they had a little display there, and I've been there since, and it's not there anymore. All right? I kind of wish I would have taken a picture of this. I did not. But they had this little cartoon showing how life originated on the early Earth. All right? You have this lightning strike and these chemicals bonding together, and these amino acids forming these proteins and all that. And it was almost like they were there. All right? And they showed you exactly how it happened. But then there was a little plaque there or something that made the statement we now know that all of life on Earth came from the same source, only one source, because of the incredible improbability against it happening twice. Now, I'm not as smart as they are, I admit that, but I had a question. My question was this: if it could not happen a second time, how did it happen the first time? And the answer is because we're here. You remember the session from this morning about your presuppositions and your bias? All right? If you have already assumed there can be no God and no supernatural, it really doesn't matter what the probability says or what the odds are. We're here, and therefore it had to happen one time. All right, so that's the way they look at it. Another problem they have is that when it comes to life, amino acids occur in both left and right-handed varieties. And in life, only left-handed amino acids are used. If you have even one right-handed amino acid in a string, it will destroy life. There was a famous experiment done several years ago by a man named Stanley Miller. I think he was actually a graduate student at the time. But he had this experiment, which was a pretty simple experiment, but he had what he considered to be, you know, the different elements that would have been involved in the atmosphere on the early Earth, and he put a spark in there, and sure enough, he had formed some very simple amino acids. But then he cheated and he separated those out because the same spark that created them would have torn them apart, destroyed them far quicker. So he kind of cheated and separated them out, and he got what was primarily tar, but he got a few amino acids, and that was heralded almost as the making life in a test tube. But one of the problems among many was that he had both left and right-handed amino acids. And so again, even one right-handed amino acid in the string would destroy life. So that's another problem that they have. Even more importantly, all right, they got another problem. Let's grant them a huge assumption, and let's say that by some miracle, there was some sort of simple life form that by chance was brought together by spontaneous generation in the early Earth, All right, that thing is now alive. Let me ask a very simple question. If that thing can't reproduce itself, what's going to happen? It's going to die, and you're going to have to start all over with the same odds stacked against you, right? So what had to happen is the DNA instructions, the genetic instructions on the DNA molecule had to already be there at one and the same time, because if you think about it, it's the DNA that codes for the proteins, but the proteins build the DNA. So which came first, the DNA or the proteins? Both of them had to be there at one and the same time. So you had to have two simultaneous miracles happening at the same time for you to get life. It's almost like the old chicken and the egg paradox. Now we know the answer to that as believers, that the chicken came first. All right, but which came first, the DNA or the proteins? Both of them had to be there at one and the same time. So how are you going to do that? So DNA could stand for definitely no accident. It's evidence that there is a God, that there is a creator. As a matter of fact, let's talk about the concept of information and complexity for a few minutes. The theory of evolution basically has the idea that matter plus energy plus time somehow equals life. But the problem is they've left out one very important factor in that equation, and that is the factor of outside intelligence, which is always necessary for the origin of life. The law of biogenesis, that life always comes from life. I'm going to have some quotes from a book by a man named Werner Gitt. Gitt is a Christian. He's a German information scientist. He's written a book called In the Beginning Was Information. And here's a quote from Gitt. He says this. He says, since the findings of James Watson and Francis Crick, it was increasingly realized by contemporary researchers that the information residing in the cells is of crucial importance for the existence of life. Anyone who wants to make meaningful statements about the origin of life would be forced to explain how the information originated. All evolutionary views are fundamentally unable to answer this crucial question. So where does the information come from? Here's another quote, this time by Paul Davies, who's an evolutionary physicist, a very famous scientist. He says, how did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Nobody knows. There is no known law of physics able to create information from nothing. Let me give you another quote. This one is from a fascinating book I have in my library by a man, he's recently passed away, unfortunately, but his name is Antony Flew. He was once, as the title of his book says, one of the world's most notorious atheists. He was a philosopher that actually engaged in debates against theists about the existence of God. And he wrote a book called There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. And now he never became a Christian, as far as I know, unfortunately. But he did become a theist. He became a believer in a God. And the reason for that is partially because of this argument about information. Let me give you a quote from his book. He says, the philosophical question that has not been answered in the origin of life studies is this: how can a universe of mindless matter produce beings with intrinsic ends, self-replication capabilities, and coded chemistry? Here we are not dealing with biology, but an entirely different category of problem. That's an excellent point, because information is not material. Let me illustrate. I can hold a compact disc in my hand, and it is physical. It is material. I can use it as a frisbee and throw it at you if I want to, because it's material. But the information on that CD is not material. So you can't possibly conceive of a material process to bring about that information, because it's not tangible, it's not material. So where does the information come from? Werner Gitt says there is no known natural law through which matter can give rise to information, neither is there any physical process or material phenomena known that can do this. Information can be something as simple as the Morse code, which is a series of dots and dashes that you can compose a novel if you have enough time and space using the Morse code. All right, it communicates information. The English alphabet is another example of information. You can create words using letters, but keep this in mind, that only communicates information if an individual already knows the code. In other words, they speak English. If they don't speak English, that doesn't communicate a thing. So the information that's on the DNA has to somehow be interpreted already, by the organism in order to be able to reproduce itself. Werner Gitt again says this: a code system is always the result of a mental process. In other words, it requires an intelligent origin or inventor. It should be emphasized that matter as such is unable to generate any code. All experiences indicate that a thinking being voluntarily exercising his own free will, cognition, and creativity is required. Now, let me illustrate. I don't know if you probably can't read that, all right? And I'm not sure if I can read it from here because the print is very small. But we have two scientists, and the one on the left is involved in something called the SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. In eastern West Virginia, in a little town called Green Bank, there's a lot of these huge radio telescopes pointing into outer space. And one of the things that they are doing is they are searching for the simplest coded signal from space. If they got something as simple as an SOS from space, it would be on the front page of every newspaper in the world the next day, heralding that there is life in outer space. And the reason for that is the guy says, if you could read it, he says, we know for certain there's intelligence out there because coded information does not arise by chance. Now, the guy on the right is involved, let's say, in microbiology or something like that, and he makes the statement, the precisely coded information in each cell would fill many books, but we know for certain that no intelligence created life. Do you see the hypocrisy there? The DNA molecule is the most efficient information storage system known in the universe. And there is all kinds of information there, and yet they argue that that happened by chance. And yet a simple coded signal from outer space would indicate that there's life in space because the bottom line is information does not arise by chance. So you see the hypocrisy that's there. Anthony Flew made this statement in conclusion of this section. He says, and again, this is the atheist that became a theist. This too is my conclusion. The only satisfactory explanation for the origin of such indirected, self-replicating life as we see on earth is an infinitely intelligent mind. And I agree wholeheartedly with that statement. Now let's also talk a little bit about what we'll call the second law of thermodynamics. When it comes to this primordial soup, it is involved as well. Second law of thermodynamics is one of the most fundamental of all scientific laws. No one disputes it. No one disagrees with it. Everyone agrees with it. Basically, it states the idea that energy naturally goes from a state of usable energy to a state of less usable energy for doing work. Something called entropy. In other words, simply put, everything is running down. Everything is decaying. Everything is getting more disorderly. You can see that in everyday life. If you don't maintain your car, it falls apart. If you don't clean your house, it gets dusty and dirty. Our bodies are aging. They're getting older. Everything is running down. Everyone agrees with that. Here's a quote from the late atheist Isaac Asimov, who said, as far as we know, all changes are in the direction of increasing entropy, of increasing disorder, of increasing randomness, of running down. Now, evolutionists understand that, but they argue that that may be true, but with something like the Earth is not an isolated system. It's an open system. In other words, we have an outside energy source, more specifically the sun, that supplies energy to the Earth, and when you have outside energy, you can overcome the second law of thermodynamics. And they might use illustrations such as a seed growing into a tree as supposedly overcoming the second law of thermodynamics. But contrary to what they say, energy alone is not going to be sufficient. Raw energy is not what you need. You can take a bull and put it in your proverbial china shop, and you can let that bull run around, and that's a whole lot of energy. But is that going to make anything more complex or anything more orderly? And obviously, it's not. So energy by itself is not sufficient. Here's a quote from a Harvard scientist. There are no known violations of the second law of thermodynamics. Ordinarily, the second law is stated for isolated systems, but the second law applies equally well to open systems. So what happens when you do add energy to, let's say you have that Boeing 747 illustration again. You have all the parts for the airplane, you add a tornado which produces it's a lot of energy, but you never assemble the airplane. Or let's change our illustration slightly. Let's say you have a pile of building materials. Everything that you need to build a building, it's all there. It's on the construction site. Once again, you can run a tornado through there all you want, but you're never going to assemble a building from that. So energy by itself is not sufficient. What you need is four things. You need, number one, you do need an open system. That's true. You do need energy, but that's not all you need. Secondly, and of course the energy source, like the sun. But thirdly, you need an energy conversion system like, for instance, photosynthesis that plants use to convert the solar energy from the sun to chemical energy that the plant can actually use to grow. Or you take the building materials on a work site illustration, all right, you can have a bunch of workers that are there and they eat food and their bodies convert that food into energy that they can use to construct the building. All right, so you have energy and a conversion system. And finally, you need a control system, which would be something like the genetic code on a DNA molecule of a plant that tells the plant how to use that energy. Or let's say a blueprint on a construction site that tells the workers, again, how to put the things together. So again, the key is intelligence to overcoming the second law. So summing up this entire section, we've looked at this idea of information, and we can look at it just from the basis of observational science. And I would like to argue that it confirms the Word of God. It does not confirm, in my opinion, the theory of evolution. So once again, what I've been saying all weekend is what we see in God's world agrees with what we read in God's Word. Now, let me move on to a second question, and let's move on from the idea of initial life to the idea of progression of life from something simple to something complex. Let's assume that they do have a simple life form, and that's a huge assumption. But let's give them that. Let's grant them that assumption that they have a simple life form. Do the proposed mechanisms for biological evolution allow for evolution? And there's only two mechanisms they propose, and that's natural selection and mutations. So does that allow for biological evolution? Obviously, if things change, single cell to invertebrates, for instance, invertebrates to fish to amphibians, etc., there's got to be some mechanism that drives that change. Okay, what is the mechanism that does that? We have to be able to answer that question. Now, if we ask the question, do animals change? That's almost used as a trick question sometimes against creationists. And the answer is simply, of course animals change. They change all the time. Genesis chapter 1, it talks about how every animal that God created reproduced, quote, after its kind. All right, here's an example in Genesis 1:25, and God made the beasts of the earth after his kind. Now, kind does not correspond, it's the Hebrew word men, it doesn't correspond to any modern classification system, you know, like phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. It doesn't correspond to any of that. But a kind is simply a variety of animal that God created, and there can be a lot of variation within a kind, but there can never be any change from one kind into another. So again, a lot of varieties of dogs and cats, but no dads or cogs. And here's, you know, some examples. You have what you might call the cat or the feline kind. And it's very likely that all of these were originally from the same created kind. Same way with all the elephants or the pachyderms, which would include mammoths and so forth. They were probably all from the same created kind. And the same way with horses and zebras and donkeys, and all the same created kind. You can go to the Creation Museum, for instance, and see a zonkey. And they also had, when I was there, a zorse, which is a cross between a zebra and a horse. And they're illustrating a point with that again, this is all the same created kind. So God created all these animals and all these plants with all kinds of genetic information whereby you could get a lot of variety. All right? But that's not evolution in the sense that we think about it, and I'll explain that more in a second. Matter of fact, let me get into a couple definitions. We need to distinguish between two terms, and I don't necessarily like these terms, but they're the terms that are typically used, so I'm going to use them. And that is the terms microevolution as opposed to macroevolution. And it's important to understand the difference between the two. Microevolution would be the idea of, and by the way, microevolution is scientifically verifiable. It's accepted by creationists just like evolutionists. All right? It's something you can see all around you. It's just simply the idea of change within a created kind. Whether that happens naturally or whether that happens through human selection, it's just change within a kind. Macroevolution, in contrast, is the whole idea of molecules to man. That's two far different things. Let me give you a quote from Marjorie Green, a philosopher of science, who said that the color of moths and snails or the bloom on the castor bean stem are explained by mutation and natural selection is very likely. But how from single-celled, and for that matter from inanimate ancestors, there came to be castor beans and moths and snails, and how from these there emerged llamas and hedgehogs and lions and apes and men, this is a question which the neo-Darwinian theory simply leaves unasked. That's exactly right. Now, when talking about micro versus macro, sometimes I'll have people, and I've had evolutionists tell me that if you have a little bit of change and you add up that little bit of change over time, that can add up to a lot of change. And that makes sense logically. In other words, if you have a lot of small changes, that can add up to some pretty huge changes over time, and that's what they try to do. They try to argue that way. But what they don't tell you is that every example of microevolution that's ever been observed is an example actually of a loss of genetic information, not an increase in genetic information like you need for macroevolution. Now let me illustrate that concept. Let's say that we have a train. And I've heard people say illustrations something like this. Let's say you're in Chicago and there's a train and it heads out of the train station and you see it go the first mile and then it goes out of sight and you don't see it. And let's say it's headed toward New York. You can say, I can assume that train will get to New York City even though I didn't see it go the whole way. I only saw it go the first mile. I can assume that it will eventually get to New York City. And my answer is not if it's heading toward Los Angeles. All right, if it's heading the wrong direction, you're not going to assume it's ever going to get there. And see, that's the problem. All right, with natural selection and mutation, every example of evolution that they're going to give you, of microevolution, is going to be an example of a loss of information when what they need, in fact, is an increase in information. And here's what I mean by that. To go from, let's say, a single-celled organism to something like a horse, you have to add a whole library of new genetic information. The same way, to go from a molecule to a man, you've got to add a whole library of new genetic information. It's estimated that a molecule would have about 2 books of 500 pages worth of coded information, whereas a man would have about 1,000 books worth. Or, to give you some more numbers, about 0.5 billion DNA letters in a microbe versus 3 billion DNA letters in a man. So the question simply becomes, where did all that information come from? The biggest difference between a microbe and me is not the size, it's the information that codes for everything. Where on earth did that information come from? Well, did it come from natural selection? Well, what is natural selection? It's simply the survival of the fittest. Can natural selection cause one thing to become another thing? And the obvious answer is no, because by definition, natural selection doesn't create any information. It only selects from information that's already there. Just like humans do with artificial selection when they're breeding for dogs or breeding for horses or whatever. So by definition, natural selection can't create any new information. And then again, let me use this example of dogs. We have all these varieties on earth today of all these wild dogs, okay? And just a huge variety. And not only the wild dogs, but we have pretty much determined scientifically that all the domestic dogs originally came from a wild variety that was probably something like a wolf, and that quote indicates that. So today you have all these domestic varieties of dogs as well. You have something as big as a Great Dane, as small as a Chihuahua, whatever. Let me give you some statistics about the incredible amount of variability that is possible because of the information on our genes. 2 human beings, a man and a woman, the number of children that one couple can have without 2 being exactly the same is 10 to the 2017th power. Now, obviously, identical twins are exactly the same, but excluding identical twins, 1 in 10 to the 2017th power. All right, and again, there's only 10 to the 80th, as far as their estimate, atoms in the known universe. So going back to the dog illustration, let's assume we started out with 2 dogs. Let's say maybe they wandered off of Noah's Ark, all right, and you have 2 canines. And, of course, they have puppies, and they have puppies, and they have puppies, and you know how that works. And so eventually you have lots of dogs, okay? And let's assume that they all initially were basically around Mount Ararat there in that general vicinity of the world. And, of course, they're going to be scattered, all right? Maybe with the Tower of Babel, they're scattered with human beings, but for whatever reason they scatter. And, of course, different groups will take different parts of the genetic information with them. Not any one group will have all the genetic information, and so they'll get different directions, all right, and they'll have different sets of genetic information. And then another thing will happen too, Well, as they begin to have puppies and whatnot, over time, you might lose the ability to have certain features. For instance, if you start with medium fur length, and eventually you might get two dogs that have only long fur and come together and can only have long-furred puppies. Take two collies, for instance. If you have two collies come together, can they have puppies with short hair? And the answer is obviously no. They've lost that ability. They've lost that genetic information. So you can, in a sense, come up with new breeds, and if you want to define it as a species, you can even say it's a new species. But it's not new information, it's actually a loss of information. And what else would have happened, because of different climates and different environments, you take dogs that would go to the far north where climates were very cold. Typically, the long-haired varieties would survive, the short-haired varieties would not. And over time, you would get dogs that just had long hair. And the same way, dogs that went to the hotter climates, maybe near the equator, dogs with short hair would do far better than dogs with long hair. And over time, all the long-haired varieties might die out, and then you'd have only dogs with short hair. That's natural selection. That's how it works. We see it all the time. And so you start with something like a wolf, and you work your way down, less and less and less information, until you get to the Chihuahua, and you have a genetic mutant at that point. And that's funny, but actually I'm very serious in one sense. Let me ask this question. You take a purebred dog, and you take your stereotypical dog-pound mutt, which one is more healthy? The mutt, all right? The purebred dog, you have to have health insurance for that thing, all right? There's so many problems. The mutt, you can run over with a Mack truck, and it'll stand up and keep going, all right? And the problem is the purebred dogs have the same mistakes in the same places on their genes because they've been interbred so much, and so they have all these problems because they've lost so much information. And so we see how that works. And the same thing is true with human beings. All right, we have human beings that are 3'9" or 7'1". That's not evolution in the sense that the word is usually used. That's just variation. And in the same way with skin color, with eye shape, it's all genetics. All right? And that can be very easily explained by genetics. So therefore, it is very, very, very misleading when the media or the scientific establishment, and they do this all the time, they will give you an example of microevolution and try to use that to prove macroevolution. And let me give you a quote. This is from Philip Johnson's book, Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds. He says that one word, evolution, can mean something so tiny it hardly matters, or so big it explains the history of the universe. Keep your baloney detector trained on the word, and if it moves, zap it. You might call that the bait and switch tactic. So they'll say, see, this moth changed colors, and that's an example of evolution, so therefore we have proved evolution. And what they've done is they've changed their definition of evolution mid-sentence. And they can't do that. It's bait and switch. So they're using a different definition of evolution. Now, what about mutations? Can mutations supply the new information necessary for evolution? All right, for that to happen, you'd have to have a benefit. This is all hypothetical. You'd have to have a beneficial mutation. Natural selection would need to select that, all right, over other existing genes. And then the mutation had to be inherited by the offspring. And theoretically, you could get new information. But here's the couple problems. Number one, almost all mutations are bad. 99.whatever% of mutations are not helpful. This is an example of a featherless chicken, for instance. It's a mutation, or a pig with a couple snouts. I mean, this is obviously not helpful, okay? Hypothetically, with mutations, they can be detrimental, they can be neutral, or they can be beneficial. Obviously, if they're detrimental, they're not going to produce evolution. If they're neutral, there's going to be no change. They're not going to produce evolution. If they're beneficial, you have to first ask the question, do they add information? If they don't, they're not going to produce evolution. Does it change the morphology or something structurally? And only if it does can you possibly have evolution. Now, with mutations, there's several kinds. There's insertions, deletions, inversions, duplications, etc. Almost all are harmful or neutral. As a matter of fact, just think of it logically. What happens when you copy? So let's say you have a piece of music on a CD or something, and you copy it over and over and over and over and over again. Do you usually improve the quality, or do you have more noise and more randomness that pops up? Obviously, you have the latter. But sometimes they will give examples of what they consider to be beneficial mutations, and I'll give you some examples. Flightless birds on islands that can swim and dive better because there's nowhere to fly to anyway, and so they're actually able to swim and dive better. That's an advantage. They'll use examples. This is similar. Wingless beetles on windy islands are not blown out to sea that way, so that obviously is an advantage for them. Or eyeless fish in caves deep under the ocean where you can't see anything anyway, and if you hit your eye on a rock, that could cause infection, so you're obviously better off without eyes anyway. Now, what I've given thus far, these three, I think everyone in the room can answer this question. Are these examples of an increase or a decrease in information? Decrease. I mean, it should be blatantly obvious that that's the case. But also, they will use examples like bacterial resistance to antibiotics and insect resistance to pesticides as examples of beneficial mutations. But I would like to argue that every one of these, if you look at them, represent losses of genetic information. Let me look at an example, for instance, the bacteria gaining resistance to antibiotics. Let's take this particular bacteria, H. pylori. What normally happens is the antibiotic is absorbed through the cell wall. The bacteria actually produces an enzyme that converts the antibiotic into a poison that eventually kills the bacteria. That's how it normally works. But sometimes you have mutant strains that survive and reproduce. And what has happened with these particular bacteria, there's been a mutation that they've lost the ability to produce the enzyme, and therefore the antibiotic is ineffective, and they survive and reproduce. But it's not because of more information, it's because of less information. Let me give you a quote by Dr. J.C. Sanford in his book, Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome. He says, the resistant bacterium has not evolved. In fact, it has digressed genetically and is defective. Such a mutant strain is rapidly replaced by the superior natural bacteria as soon as the antibiotic is removed. In other words, the only place these things survive well is in hospitals where all the other bacteria are killed off. You know, and of course that's a problem in a hospital when they survive like that. But in the real world, they wouldn't do well at all because they are indeed mutants. Also, insects and pesticides. Actually, it's been found that there's been many, with the idea of pesticides and some insects being immune to the pesticides, it's actually been shown that there's been varieties of those insects from the very beginning that were resistant to certain pesticides. The end of this quote says the genetic variants required for resistance to the most diverse kinds of pesticides were apparently present in every one of the populations exposed to these man-made compounds. All right, so we don't see examples of increases of information with mutations. Here's a quote: mutations are a rare phenomena, and a simultaneous change of even 2 amino acid residues in one protein is totally unlikely. One could think, for instance, that by constantly changing amino acids one by one, it will eventually be possible to change the entire sequence substantially. These minor changes, however, are bound to eventually result in a situation in which the enzyme has ceased to perform its previous function, but has not yet began its new duties. It's at this point it will be destroyed along with the organism carrying it. Let me move from the microbiological level of the cell for a minute to biological level and give you an example of that. Some evolutionists claim that some dinosaurs evolved over time into birds. You've probably heard that argument, okay? Now, let me ask you a question. What's going to happen in the in-between stage when that dinosaur has legs and it's evolving wings, but when that appendage is a half a leg and a half a wing? In other words, it can't walk on it anymore. It can't fly with it yet. How is that thing going to survive? It doesn't even make sense. All right? At some point, it becomes absurd. Here's a phenomenal quote by a scientist by the name of Lee Spetner. He's a Jewish scientist. He actually taught at Johns Hopkins University. He got a PhD from MIT, so this is a sharp guy. He's written a book called Not by Chance. He's an information scientist, and here's his quote: "But in all the reading I've done in the life sciences literature, I've never found a mutation that added information. All point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information, not to increase it." Here's a guy that claims he has studied this out, and he has yet to find even one mutation that has added genetic information. Now, I'm not going to say dogmatically it's never happened. Maybe it has. But the bottom line is you need more than one. This quote here, I won't even read it for the sake of time, but this guy is saying you have to have more than one. You have to have thousands, if not millions, of these mutations in a row to get an increase in complexity that would lead from one organism to another. And yet they can't even find evidence for one. If evolution has really happened and things are getting more complex over time, we should see natural selection over time eliminate many of the harmful genetic disorders that we witness today. But that is not at all happening. It's just the opposite. We have over 6,000 Mendelian diseases that are known today, things like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, etc., that are all as a result of mistakes, copying mistakes in our genes. Mutations, if you will. And I would like to argue that we are not evolving, we are devolving. The human genome is degrading to random nonsense. And if you give it enough time, that's exactly what it's going to do. One of those most powerful books I have read, and I read this in the last couple of years, it's relatively new. It's by a man by the name of Dr. J.C. Sanford. He was a plant geneticist. He did a lot of genetic engineering work with plants. He came up with a process of genetic engineering known as the gene gun. He was a Cornell professor, but he's written, and he's become a Christian, by the way. He was an evolutionist. He's now become a young earth creationist. I think he works for Creation Ministries International some. It's Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome is the name of his book. And his book is fascinating because the basic thesis of the book is this. Not only can evolutionists not account for where the information came from, they cannot account for why it is still there. Because modern science has learned that the mutation rate in human beings is remarkably high. The most conservative estimate is that there's about, this is a conservative estimate, that there's about 100 new mutations per generation. In other words, every time a new baby is born, 100 new genetic mutations. About 2 to 3% of all babies born today have some sort of a visible genetic defect. Each of us carry tens of thousands of genetic mutations. We're far inferior to caveman, you know, if you believe in caveman or so forth. And see, the problem is most mutations are very, very minor. They're very, very small, and they're nearly neutral. And so they're not even going to be filtered out by natural selection. They're just going to add up over time because they're very small and they don't affect a lot of things. And usually, you know, when a father and a mother come together, the mistakes on their genes are in different places. And so the good gene's usually going to override the bad gene, and typically that stuff's not going to come out necessarily physically in the baby. But all these mutations are adding up over time. And the bottom line is if the human race is really as old as evolutionists claim, it ought to be like every time you get married and have children, it's just like marrying your sister. And you have all these genetic deformities with all the children. And so the bottom line is they can't even account for how that information is still there after all these years. So with that in mind, again, we've looked at the concept of biological evolution, the concept of created kinds as opposed to new kinds evolving by random chance. And again, just looking at it from observational science, I would like to conclude that once again confirms the Word of God, at least in my opinion. Now, there's one other line of evidence I want to end with, and that is I want to ask this question, not did evolution occur, I'm still asking could it have occurred, but does the complexity of life allow for biological evolution? Let me give you a verse from Scripture. Psalm 139:14 says, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. Our bodies are indeed fearfully and wonderfully designed. You take something like the eye, and think about the complexity of the human eye. Charles Darwin, even in his book, had a section where he admitted that complex organs like the eye would be very, very difficult for his theory to account for, even though he assumed that it must have happened somehow gradually. All right? And a lot of people today try to argue, there's a man by the name of Richard Dawkins who's a well-known evolutionist. A lot of you have probably heard of him. He actually speculates that perhaps the eye began with a light-sensitive spot. You know, and you start with that, and then over time it evolves eventually into an eye. Well, let's think about that argument for a second. First of all, let me ask this question. Look at the design of that eye there. Let's say hypothetically that you have 50% of an eye in place. Let me ask a question. What percentage of vision do you have? 0. Matter of fact, if you have 90% of an eye in place, what percentage of vision do you have? 0. You see, it all has to be there at the same time for it to function properly. All right? Let me give you a quote from Michael Behe, who is a part of the intelligent design movement. He's written a book called Darwin's Black Box. Fascinating book. He says, not only is the eye exceedingly complex, but the light-sensitive spot with which Dawkins begins his case is itself a multi-celled organ, each of whose cells makes the complexity of a motorcycle or television set look paltry in comparison. And that is the point he begins his case with. In other words, he assumes that to start with before he even starts the process of evolving it into something else. That's a huge leap of faith that he begins with. In 1949, the famous British evolutionist JBS Haldane claimed that evolution could never produce, quote, various mechanisms such as the wheel and magnet, which would be useless till fairly perfect. That was 1949. Today we know that turtles, monarch butterflies, some bacteria use magnetic sensors for navigation. So magnetism occurs naturally in nature. Not only do we have wheels in nature, but we have full-fledged what amounts to electric motors in nature. This is a picture of a bacterial flagellum. And it's what some bacteria use to navigate. You know, it propels them forwards and backwards and whatever. These things can revolve up to 100,000 revolutions per minute and stop practically on a dime and turn in the other direction. You can fit up to 8 million of these in the cross-sectional area of a human hair. And here's a design of a bacterial flagellum. Doesn't that look like something a human engineer designed? It's got a rotor and a stator and a universal joint, and we're to believe that that all happened by chance. All right, and can you even conceive of, logically, the step-by-step process that would lead to that? Michael Behe, in his book, has coined a term he calls irreducible complexity. And he defines it this way. He says that is a system composed of several well-matched, interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. He's got a very simple illustration in his book, and he has a very simple machine that is a mousetrap, your everyday, ordinary mousetrap that you've all seen. And this thing has 5 parts. And his question is simply this: can you even conceive of a step-by-step process that would naturally lead to the mousetrap? In other words, what part of the mousetrap can you do without and still catch a mouse? All right, well, let's think about it. You obviously have to have the platform because that's what holds everything else together. You obviously have to have the hammer because that's what kills the mouse. You obviously have to have the spring because that's what applies the pressure. I suppose you could chase the mouse around going like that and try to catch it and maybe do it like that, but you have to have the spring. And then you have to have the catch to activate it and the holding bar to hold it back initially. So the bottom line is that system is irreducibly complex because you can't do without any one of those 5 parts and still catch a mouse. It has to all be there at one and the same time for it to work effectively. Let's move to the realm of biology and use as an example something like a giraffe with its long neck. I would like to argue it's irreducibly complex. All right? Because of its long neck, there's got to be a lot of blood pressure to get that blood all the way up the neck to the brain. But that presents a problem when a giraffe bends down to get a drink of water, thus increasing the pressure in the head and the neck tremendously. All right, that could very easily burst the blood vessels in the head. That could produce a lot of problems with that thing. All right, but a giraffe, and hypothetically, again, it could burst the blood vessels, but the giraffe just so happens, and I put that in quotes, just so happens to have pressure sensors along the arteries that can detect a rise in pressure. That causes the contraction of the artery walls, allowing the arteries to constrict, controlling the blood flow. Some arteries approaching the head then bypass the brain. Also, heavily valved veins control the return of the blood to the heart. And so the question becomes, which came first, the long neck or the rest of the package? Bottom line is, it all had to be there at the same time, or it never would have survived. The giraffe is irreducibly complex, You can't even conceive of a gradual process to produce that long neck without already having all that other stuff in place. It had to all be there together. So therefore, I would like to conclude for the last time that what we see in God's world agrees with what we read in God's Word. So I could conclude this lecture this way: the origin of life by natural processes is not possible. There's not enough time, and even if you had infinity, life is too complex. It's just impossible. We're all looking at the same evidence. Many scientists do believe in creation. Neither evolution nor creation can be proven scientifically. Both involve faith. It's your choice which model to believe. All right, and that's the same for all of us. And of course, there are incredible internal implications of the choice that you make about origins. So once again, let me give you the websites, and then I'll try to get to some of these questions. If you want more information, in addition to the books in the back, if you want to pick up my booklets or some of the catalogs in the back, you can also go to these websites. And by the way, you can also order materials from the websites if you're interested in books or videos or whatever. And if you just want articles, there's tons of articles. You can just type in almost any question about creation and evolution. I almost guarantee you there's multiple articles on these websites. But answersingenesis.org, ICR.org for the Institute for Creation Research, Creation.com for Creation Ministries International. Again, if you ever want to go to the museum, you can check it out there. And then Christian Answers Net as well is a very good website. All right, what I'm going to do next then is I'm going to try to briefly answer these questions that I was sent. And I hope I can answer the questions accurately. I don't claim to know all the answers, but and I don't have time to get into a lot of details, but let's try to get through these one by one. First question I have here is, how do they come up with billions and billions of years in uniformitarianism? And the answer to that I sort of answered, I guess, last night, but the bottom line is there is no independent, objective way that they do come up with it. It is assumed from the onset. It is assumed from the onset that the earth is billions of years old, and then they interpret the evidence in light of that. Now, granted, they can take the radioisotope dating methods that we talked about last night, and sometimes that will give ages of billions of years for these rocks. But like I said last night, you have to have some huge assumptions with those dating methods. That, the rate's always the same, no parent or daughter element's ever been added or lost, and that probably there was no daughter element there initially, and it can be shown that those assumptions are not true with rocks of known age. So the answer is they assume it from the onset, and then they try to show that through experimentation or whatever. Number two, why is radiocarbon dating inaccurate? Well, it's not necessarily inaccurate. The science behind it is actually fine. And if you realize, as I mentioned again last night, that the ratio of a carbon-14 to carbon-12 is not yet in equilibrium, that carbon-14 is still building up, and if you account for that in your equations, carbon dating can actually be a very accurate method. Keep in mind, though, again, I'm reviewing from last night, carbon dating cannot be used on rocks or fossils because those are things that have turned to rock. It can only be used on things that were once alive, such as bone material or wood material or something like that. But after about 50, 60,000 years, even evolutionists admit that the method's useless because there's going to be no carbon-14 and no traces of it left because it's all decayed away by that point in time. All right? And I won't go take the time to explain the whole method again. I did that last night. But it can be a useful method if you have the right assumptions. If you don't, it can be inaccurate. And what is neat for us as creationists using carbon dating is that you can actually find traces of carbon-14 in things like coal and diamonds that are supposedly millions of years old, but that the fact that you find traces of carbon-14 show that these things can't be any more than 50, 60,000 years old. And of course, we believe they're far less than that. But that shows that. All right, next question, is it possible to clone a human, or has it been done? Well, no, it's not been done yet. I believe that in the future it probably will be possible. I don't think we as human beings should be doing that. I think there's incredible ethical implications from that we need to be very careful about. And that type of thing kind of it's a scary thought to think about that. You think about the ethical questions, or even as Christians, all right, if you clone a human being, Does that human being have an eternal soul? And I would have to argue yes. Just like an identical twin, basically. It would have an eternal soul. God, I'm sure, would take care of all that. But I don't think we as human beings have any right messing with life. All right, and so I don't like the thought of that. But no, it's not been done yet. Could it be? Yes, possibly. Given enough time. All right, who knows? The next question, how many land animal fossils have been found on or near the tops of mountains? I don't precisely know the answer to that question, but I will say this. Keep in mind that when we're talking about mountaintops today, at the time of the flood, even before the flood, you did not have the same topography that we have today. You didn't have the mountain ranges we have today. The whole topography of the earth was changed and modified radically by the flood. And so the mountains that we have today were, I think, lifted up after the flood. As God raises up the mountains, He puts the trenches in the oceans, and that's what drains the waters off the land. And so I know for a fact that you do find marine creatures on mountaintops all over the earth. And I'm assuming that you find all kinds of different animal fossils as well. But keep in mind that those rock layers were once even with everything else, but they were lifted up. All right, so the fact that they're up on the top of mountains now is not maybe that significant as we might think. Next question is, where did the races come from? Well, we answered that sort of tonight. That's just genetics. I would argue that there's no such thing as races. Biblically, there's no such thing as races. There's only one race, the human race. Everything else is just genetics. You take skin color, for instance. Skin color is nothing more. It comes from a pigment called melanin. Everyone has it. We all have it. It's just that some of us have more than others. All right? And it's all based on genetics. All right? Some people have a lot of melanin and they have darker skin. Some people have little of it and they have lighter skin. But it's all genetics. And the same way with hair color, eye shape, whatever, it all can be explained by genetics. So, very simply, you have, go back to Noah and his children. You have Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives on the ark. All right, and at the Tower of Babel, you have all these people still gathered together, but then at Babel, God scatters everyone in different directions, and you probably have different family groups going different directions. And they all have different amounts of information on their genes. They have different information. And they get isolated away from the rest of the human population. And so there's sort of a bottleneck that occurs genetically. And over time, these different people groups lose the ability to have, babies with light skin or dark skin or whatever. I believe, Adam and Eve are usually pictured in books as like Caucasian looking. I don't believe that was the case at all. I believe that they were mid-brown. As a matter of fact, I have seen examples, if you have the right set of parents even today, and for this to work, both parents have to have sort of a dark and light-skinned parent themselves. All right? So if you get 2 children like that together, I have seen pictures of a couple with twins, and you would swear that one of those is African and one of those is Caucasian. It's light, and they're twins. So I believe that Adam and Eve could have had children of any color. It was probably what's going to come out next, as they were having babies. And it's all genetic. So again, there's only one race, the human race. Next question, where did angels come? When did angels come into existence? And how about Lucifer's fall? That's one we can only speculate on because the Bible doesn't tell us that. So anything I say is just speculation. I would argue that probably, as a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure that the fall of Satan had to come after Genesis 1:31. Because in Genesis 1:31, God surveys His creation. He says everything is very good. All right, that's at the end of the 6 days. So I would surmise that probably sometime after that point, and obviously before the fall into sin, and we have no idea how long that was, but it probably wasn't very long because He didn't have children yet. So probably somewhere between those 2 points is where Satan fell. Now, as far as when were angels created, again, I can only speculate. If I had to take a guess, I would say maybe day 1 of creation. When God creates the heavens and the earth, there's a passage in the book of Job that talks about the angels witnessing, I think, when God laid the foundations of the earth. So that almost implies that maybe they were around there at the beginning. But I can't dogmatically answer that because, again, the Bible just doesn't say. Next question is, what are UFOs? That's a very good question. If you want to study that question, there's a book by a man named Gary Bates, who is currently the the CEO of Creation Ministries International in the USA. I believe the name of his book is Alien Intrusion. You can get on their website and find that. I've read that book. It's fascinating. And basically his thesis in that book is when people, all these UFO sightings, and a lot of them are very similar and some of the very same things they're describing, there's no evidence whatsoever for any physical phenomena. And he goes into even some of the so-called happenings in Roswell, New Mexico, and explains that. And there's no evidence for anything physically. But there's all kinds of evidence that people are seeing and experiencing something. And he concludes, and he makes a very strong case, that it's all demonic. That ultimately there is a spiritual realm out there. Demons are just fallen angels, right? You remember Ezekiel chapter 1, when Ezekiel sees that vision of the chariot, and remember the wheels inside the wheels and the eyes on the wheels, and the thing could go any direction at once. And if you saw that, I mean, he can't even describe it. I mean, he's looking for words to describe what he's seeing. It's something like this. It's kind of like that. It's whatever. If you saw that, what would that be? Well, it would definitely be an unidentified flying object if you saw something like that. And so I believe that UFOs are probably all demonic. And it's fascinating, even in Gary Bates' book, he gives first of all, Christians are hardly ever see these things. And he uses examples of people who supposedly are seeing the aliens that will evoke the name of Christ, and they're gone. All right, so it's fascinating if you want to read that book. Please explain the pros and cons of the carbon dating method. Well, I've sort of answered that question already. I think it can be a legitimate method if it's done right. But the cons are, again, it can't be used for anything over 50, 60,000 years anyway, which we don't think there is anything older than that anyway. And the cons are sometimes they don't account for the fact that there is no equilibrium yet with carbon-14 and carbon-12, and that skews some of their answers. So it can be effective, but you have to sort of, again, understand the presuppositions just like everything else. Another question, did dinosaurs and all the flying creatures discovered that existed, did they freely roam the earth up to the flood? And if the flood event wiped them out, what happened with the sea-based creatures of the same era? Yes, I do believe that dinosaurs and the pterodactyls and the flying reptiles were around not only up to the flood. I believe they were around for a good amount of time after the flood. And the reason I say that, there are dragon legends in cultures all over the world. China has all kinds of dragon legends. The ancient Europeans not only had legends, but they had names for different types of dragons and descriptions of different types of dragons. Marco Polo supposedly saw dragons on his travels. And the ancient Indians in the American Southwest saw the thunderbirds. Furthermore, you can find pictograms in caves, which are basically cave art, that picture all these animals, and we know what most of the animals are, but I have seen examples of something that looks incredibly like a dinosaur, a sauropod. And the archaeologists or whatever, they look at that and they say, well, we know what these animals were, but this one here they just made up, or whatever. So I personally believe that dinosaurs lived with men for quite a while after the flood, before they eventually died out. And what happened to the sea-based creatures? Well, I would say that a lot of them survived for a while as well, although in something like the flood, there's a lot of marine creatures going to die as well, because there's all kinds of underwater volcanic activity and tsunamis, and you've also got all the salt and the fresh water mixing together, and you just got all kinds of stuff going on. So I'm sure a lot of these creatures would have been wiped out as well, but probably for a while survived. And I'm not going to dogmatically say that maybe there's not something alive today still in the oceans or whatever. So who knows? This question says, I have heard creationists talk about a form, or evolutionists talk about a form of evolution, or maybe it's creationists, that dogs coming from wolves. Did this happen? If it did, why does it not still happen? And if it did, does that confirm evolution? Well, I answered that tonight, basically. Obviously, dogs did come from something like wolves, and yes, that can still happen. But no, it does not confirm macroevolution. It confirms microevolution, But that is, again, an example of a loss of information that does not confirm the idea of macroevolution, which would be an increase in evolution. So again, you have to understand the difference between the two. How did the dinosaurs really die out? Well, I believe the vast